Morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the Festival of IR for the IR Society annual conference. Really excited to be here. I'm Sally Pilot. I'm the Chief Insight and Engagement Director at Black Sun. And as well, I'm one of the board of the Investor Relations Society, and I also chair the Best Practice Committee. So very excited to be part of this week's festival. Hope you've been listening to the sessions. They've been fantastic so far and really looking forward to the main day tomorrow. So hope as many of you as possible can join us. So I wanted to just give you a welcome to Black Sun's session today on creating a proactive ESG communication strategy. Don't know how many of you tuned into Revell Research's session yesterday.
I've just accessed it through Zoom, through the platform, but...
Hello. Hi, Rob. Are we live, Rob? Good. Okay. Well, anyway, just to continue on, Revell had a great session yesterday, if you haven't heard it, and I'm hoping that ours will very much follow on from that. So they did a very great overview of what the whole environment looks like. And today we're really going to talk about how do we unpick that and how do we communicate best to your investors and wider stakeholders. So before we start off, I just wanted to introduce my fellow panelists today. I have Dan Cowley, who is the head of digital strategy at Black Sun. Fantastic to have him with us today. He's got over 15 years agency experience, and he's a lovely guy. He told me I should say to everybody. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about how he's helping companies communicate their value creation story, how he's helping with that user experience, the user flow, and really bringing that story to life in the digital environment and beyond. And we know that's so important today in the way that we communicate. As well, I have Anne Kirkby, who is our Investor and ESG Communications Director at Black Sun. She's been with us, I think, almost 6 years, actually. It's gone by very quickly. And before that, she spent 10 years in the city as a buy-side ESG investor. So she's got a lot of great insight to share today. And unfortunately, I was supposed to have also Leighton Barnish, our Director of Sustainability Communications, on the panel today, but unfortunately, he's had to rush off and get a COVID test, which isn't great. So fingers crossed that he hasn't caught this new variant. So just before I kicked off, I just wanted to do a really quick overview of Black Sun for those of you that don't know us. So if we're going to move to the slide deck here, the way we're going to do it is we've got a little bit of a presentation to get here. I encourage you to ask as many questions as possible, and I'll pose them to the panelists. But we do have a bit of a slide deck to go through to really structure the session today. And just to sort of tell you a little bit about Black Sun, for those that don't know us, really our whole proposition is helping companies communicate authentically on how they deliver value to all of their different stakeholders, okay? And increasingly over time, we've moved beyond just talking to investors to wider stakeholders. And the way that we deliver that is through very focused stakeholder reporting to a myriad of stakeholders that we're dealing with, and Anne will go through that in a lot more detail in terms of how that's changed over time, very heavily through lots of different channels and formats, and using digital as a really important part of the strategy moving forward. And also, of course, this integration of ESG and sustainability into how companies communicate and also how they perform. So that's really important. So really helping companies on that journey to better communication. So that's really all I wanted to say about Black Sun. In that sense, I wanted to give you a little bit of a scene setter in terms of what we're seeing in terms of expectations on business. None of this will be a surprise. A lot of these things have come up in terms of the conference so far, and no doubt will come up in the next few days. Clearly, there's been a rise of stakeholder capitalism, okay? Sustainability and deeper connections to stakeholders are fundamental to businesses' sustainability moving forward. And there's a lot of research out there that shows how this is driving better returns for business. Sustainability is topping the corporate agenda. We know from some recent research that I read that 75% of boards are talking about ESG and sustainability issues on each board agenda. I would think it would be 100, but I think we're getting there, and COVID's really put that on the agenda. There is a rapidly changing corporate reporting landscape. My goodness, in the last 12 to 18 months, there's been more change than I think in the 12 to 18 years we've been following this very closely. So if you want to know more about that, we're very attuned to what's going on, and we can share that with you in more detail. And as I said, there's this real accelerated digital transformation that's taking place. And I mean, again, that has happened with lightning speed. The digital transformation in the past, again, 12 to 18 months has just been outstanding and really exciting, I think, moving forward. And, you know, my hope is that when we move back to some sort of normalcy after all of this, that we really retain the best of that communication and all the learnings from that. And then I think there's a greater realization and understanding of the importance of companies' impact on society. And a lot more stakeholders very focused on that. So really expectations for business are changing very rapidly. And no doubt these will continue to change very rapidly. And a lot of the issues that we've been talking about at Black Sun for years and years and years are not going to go away, which I find really exciting. So there's a real opportunity out there for companies that can embrace that. So just as we move on to the next one of the things that we do as a company that you probably know, hopefully you've seen some of our research or attended one of our events in the past. We're very keen to understand the power of communications in changing behavior, how it helps to increase transparency, and really how it helps to improve engagement between businesses and their different stakeholders. And we've been researching and following this since 2005, and we've really seen some really interesting trends, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about that moving forward. The other thing we do is we try very hard to engage with the external environment so we can understand how that's impacting our clients and how we can help shape the advice that we give to them. So if I wanted to just move to the next slide, if I could, Anne, and this really signifies for me, I think, what I would like to think out of a really terrible situation that we've been living through with the pandemic. I think the silver lining in all of this is really a lot of these issues that have been on the peripheral for a lot of companies are really up front and center. And I think that what we are finding in our experience, that corporate purpose and ESG are becoming tools to really help companies reframe post-pandemic. And we're seeing more and more that ESG factors are becoming a key determinant on financial strength and resilience. Again, a lot of research out there that's already been shared throughout the conference. And we're seeing, working with clients, that they're really refreshing and recommitting to their corporate purpose and using that as a compass for their strategy, but also to focus their ESG priorities and performance. And I think that's a really important thing to take away. So the silver lining in all of this, as I say, is that this stuff is on the agenda. I wanted to give you a sneak peek of what we've been up to. As I said, we're very heavily involved in research. So these are the 3 research projects, if we just flick to the next slide, that will be focusing on moving forward. We've got 3 research projects that we're doing. One is with global executives, and that really tracks their perceptions on the market, but also what they do. We've got one on FTSE 100 corporate websites, which will be launched on Monday. And then we've got our one on FTSE annual reports, which will be launched at the end of June. We've been doing all these research pieces for a very long time. The global executive one we do with the Value Reporting Foundation, and newly formed from SASB and IIRC. It's the 4th edition we've done. We do it every 2 years. We do it with them and the AICPA, which is the accounting organization. And what we found this year is, over time, this idea that executives believe it's critical to have a corporate purpose has become really focused on the agenda right now. So without a doubt, all companies believe it's important for them to have a corporate purpose, but the challenge still is only about half of those indicate that they really feel that they have a strong purpose. So we're not pushing against a door here. The question is not why, but the question is how. What we're finding in terms of corporate websites is that a lot more companies are communicating their corporate purpose. And these stats, Dan and Richard, our Chief Digital Officer, will be presenting the research next week. They'll be going through this in a lot more detail, but there's a lot of focus around purpose here. Yet, less than half of those really reinforce what their purpose means with content beyond what's perhaps on the homepage of their website. So really needing to demonstrate how authentic that is. And similarly in FTSE annual reports, again, we've seen a massive trend for the last 6 or 7 years in terms of those companies that articulate a corporate purpose. But again, very few, although that number is growing, really demonstrate how that is really the foundation for the business. So I really wanted to highlight that because this whole conference is about purpose-driven IR. So the next slide really goes through some of the factors that we've seen in terms of ESG factors. And what we're seeing is that these things, ESG factors, are becoming a key determinant of resilience and business sustainability. With global executives from that study, again, we're seeing that ESG factors are recognized as being key to decision-making. All dimensions of value creation are felt necessary to make well-informed decision, and many are beginning to use broader performance information to manage their business. Not all, but many are, and that's a real transition. In terms of websites, we've seen ESG disclosure continue to rocket, with 64% discussing in their investor section, which has doubled year on year for the past 2 years, and many more disclosures in various formats, which Dan's going to go through in more detail. And then, of course, in annual reports, we are seeing purpose become more purposeful. So a lot more companies linking purpose to their strategy, and a few using it as an anchor, as compass to anchor ESG priorities and performance. So we're beginning to see change, although there's a lot more to be done. So that's what I wanted to set up in terms of what we're seeing overall. And I guess what we're feeling in our experience with clients is they're really feeling what I would call a tsunami hitting them in terms of these increasing expectations of society, investors, wider stakeholders, and really the challenge is, how do we deal with that? So that's what Anne is going to help us through right now. How do we see companies dealing with that tsunami? And sorry about the credit on there. I clearly stole it late last night from Stock Library. So Anne, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. So I thought we sort of narrow the lens a little bit here and sort of start by talking about what are some of the drivers actually we're seeing in terms of ESG. So Sally has talked about some of the big picture stuff, but from a sort of, with the PLC in the middle here, what are some of the motivation for actually acting on this? So increasingly, we're seeing that companies are acting on this because it's key to sort of a customer decision making. And when I say customer decision making, I mean for B2B, for instance, where you sit in the supply chain of someone who needs you to green their supply chain for them, right? Where that becomes a competitive advantage for you in terms of dealing with your attracting your customers. Equally, customer sentiment. So that's more along the lines of sort of the brand equity, whether consumers will buy your product over the next product, and actually building that reputation around your company. Obviously, I don't need to tell you about all the employee retention and attraction benefits to a strong ESG approach. I'm sure we've all seen all the research showing that people, particularly millennials and younger generations now, are very unlikely to work for a company with a bad reputation or a bad performance on ESG. Punitive regulation, whether that's sugar taxes, whether that is plastic taxes, whether that is just reporting regulation and the burden that comes from that. There are certainly, plenty of reasons in terms of regulation to act on ESG. And reputation we've already sort of touched on. Now, the last three ones around ESG investment, green financing, and credit ratings, I thought I'd just mention a little bit more on those. Now, obviously, over the last over the last 5 years, particularly over the last 2 years, really, we have seen an enormous amount of money flow into ESG investments. And there is really, with COVID, nothing to suggest that this isn't going to increase, right? We've seen how a lot of companies, a lot of stocks that were strong on ESG have perhaps been slightly more stable, slightly more stronger, you know, stood the task somewhat stronger than other companies. So there is absolutely nothing to suggest that that won't absolutely go up going forward. The same thing goes for green financing. And I think that's a really interesting driver. And we've seen certainly with companies that might not necessarily have had a particular focus on ESG in the past, really understanding that there's a commercial opportunity here, or there's a access to capital, you know, in cheaper capital, which is all of a sudden you're getting engagement from the finance team, you're getting engagement from, you know, the CEO in a different way, you know, when you can see that there is a clear commercial opportunity. And finally, credit ratings. So we know that credit ratings are increasingly incorporating ESG factors. We also know that at the moment, while that is part of the narrative in the credit ratings, they tend to only impact about 5%, or sort of slightly under 5% of the actual ratings. However, the fact that it's integrated into the fact that these rating agencies, Moody's has bought VE, S&P have bought SAM and Trucost. That means that these are sort of relatively new developments, and that methodology will become stronger. That 5%, without a doubt, will go up. So there are, you know, a number of really good reasons to act now. Of course, we do already have quite a lot of regulation in this area. You know, we have, from a reporting perspective, you know, whether that is the Corporate Governance Code, the UK Companies Act, that actually has a number of reporting regulations in there. And we've got obviously gender pay gap reporting. We've got a number of new things coming up from, you know, the Park Review 1 in 2021. So up this year, we've got the TCFD regulation coming into place. And we've got the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. What will that mean for us in the UK? What does that mean in terms of we having a new non-financial reporting directive? What is that? How's that going to impact the existing disclosures we have around this? The same thing around, and that's a really big one, around the EU taxonomy, you know, requiring investors to communicate on the percentage of green revenue in there, or their portfolio, how green that portfolio is. And that will require companies to actually disclose how they are, you know, the percentage of their revenue that's green. And I think a lot of companies aren't necessarily in a position to do that. So that would require companies to actually start measuring, start categorizing, start looking at this, because those deadlines are coming up very soon. Obviously, we're no longer part of the EU. And we know that the government has set up a working group on this now, this week. So it'll be interesting to see what's happening, because that will have to happen quite quickly. And we also know that there's regulation coming up potentially around ethnicity pay gap reporting to supplement the gender pay gap reporting. There's a number of sort of emerging reporting frameworks we're seeing IFRS setting up, you know, a sustainability reporting standards, which has been heavily supported. That obviously will be a big driver going forward as well, and will, without a doubt, mean a big move for companies. We're seeing the, you know, a sort of standardization, a number of standards merging, and we're also seeing the FRC send out a report earlier this year around the future of corporate reporting, and really the discussion around the right formats, the right audiences, different materiality lenses. What does that all mean? And then obviously on top of all this regulation, we also have sort of an evolving agenda of best practice, you know, evolving agenda on issues that needs to be covered off, right? Obviously, corporate purpose, culture, diversity, you know, and increasingly, one of the things we've been talking to clients a lot about this year is data security, which is one of those things that's really making its way up the agenda at the moment. But that takes us on to the next bit here, which is really the the disclosure spaghetti, as I call it, the disclosure universe. And it still surprises me that a lot of companies still find it difficult to find their way. I mean, no wonder. It is a bit of a jungle, to be honest. Which one of these frameworks is really the mandatory? Which ones are sort of semi-mandatory in the way that you're being actually measured and rated, unless whether you want them to or not, right? So we start out with the reporting and management frameworks here, the GRI, the IR, integrated reporting framework, and SASB. We've got the disclosure and transparency initiatives, which tend to be focused on one particular issue. They tend to be focused on a questionnaire. They tend to have a clear deadline for when that needs to be filled in and sent in. And that is, companies having to actively do this themselves. Then we got the raters and rankers, and I've put out a number of them here. Obviously, they will rate you whether you want them to or not. And increasingly, those ratings are publicly available. So when you go to their website, you can look up your own rating, you can look up your competitors' ratings. And while you might not be able to see the level of detail that you receive in your reports from them, everybody will be able to see the top level. Now, these will rate you typically around the same time every year, but that isn't, you can't count on that either. And companies tend to think, oh, it's probably around the same time for every company. And that's not the case. It's a different time for every company, right? They're trying to cover the universe. So while those are obviously not mandatory, they are, soft mandatory in the way that you need to be managing them to a certain degree. However, prioritizing them first. And that will be, you need to be thinking about what is the industry you're in, importantly, who are your investors? What are they primarily using? Are they in fact using their own proprietary data systems that might take information from all of them, or do they have a whole different other set or different lens to be looking at it? We talked about the credit rating agencies, so I won't go into them again. And then we have the indices as well, and understanding how do ratings and indices actually link up? Who owns what? Because there is a lot of consolidation going on in the industry at the moment. It is a bit of a jungle. It is a bit of a jungle. And the last one, which is around artificial intelligence data providers, which is a really growing area, and they can scrape just about anything and are impossible for companies really to control, which is really around companies, they might scrape everything from the number of patents you filed, any industry journals any of your executive have published articles in. They might, there is no limit to the sort of amount of data that they can get from all sorts of different sources. But as I said, impossible to really manage. So the real trick here is to do that prioritization up front. And I think there's also a clear opportunity for companies to put in a lot of effort up front to get the approach right. And then they can update maybe 20% every year. But there's a big piece up front in terms of that prioritization.
Anne, I've got a quick question for you. You've painted a very clear picture that this disclosure demands are not going away for companies, and these things are clearly on the agenda. And then you've painted this picture of, oh my God, there's all this that we have to deal with. Can you just share a little bit about some of the pitfalls that companies fall into in that process? Because you talked about, spending the time up front, but what are the sort of top tips in terms of looking out for? Just very quickly, that would be helpful.
So I'd say some of the things that perhaps companies aren't getting right all the time is, not dealing with raters at all, for instance, right? I mean, I certainly know of companies, of course, none of our clients, but I know of companies who have a filing system that goes delete whenever they get the reports in, because they just don't have the resource to deal with it. And I totally understand that. That is, but I also think there is an opportunity to have that upfront piece where you do the prioritization, you do a lot of the work, a lot of disclosures up front, and you find the right formats for them, and then you only update a little bit every year, so that the work burden becomes much more manageable for the sort of day-to-day team. I also think that, you know, there's, as I said before, the sort of the interconnectedness of the disclosure universe is not really that well understood by a number of companies, right? So what's voluntary, what's not, what's public, what's not, what does investors actually want, you know, what impacts credit ratings, the link between raters and indices, all of that good stuff that we mentioned before. But also, I think some companies have a tendency to let the, you know, when they then start really engaging with the raters, they then let that story derail the narrative a little bit. So you end up with a sustainability report that is really trying to tick a lot of boxes for rankers and raters. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Your communication should be communicating your story, you know, your opportunity, your commercial opportunity as well, or your impact story. And then you need to find the right formats, whether that is a data sheets, whether that is a data book, whether that is fact sheets, where you can have all of this stuff for rankers and raters, where actually the methodology doesn't change that much. It changes a little bit every year, but then you can go in and change that 5% of that data and those policies, etc. And you can go in and do an update every year, but you've done the big piece up front, and you found the right format, and you have communicated it, you know, the bulk of information. And I also think companies have a tendency to try then go, oh, there are 250 things that Sustainalytics wants, and the same thing for MSCI, and the same thing for ISS. You know, how are we going to deal with all of that? You know, don't deal with all of it. You know, a first point could be to say, well, we'll deal with that is most material to us. And then secondly, go in and have a look at, you know, they always categorize and say these and these topics will weigh higher in the overall scoring. Within those topics, these and these particular data points will weigh higher in the overall scoring. So pick out your 50 as a starting point, pick out your 50 most material from a scoring perspective, data points, and focus on those. And I think, you know, I think also perhaps understanding that ESG is wider than sustainability, right? I think sometimes companies use the term sustainability and ESG interchangeably, and I don't think that's necessarily right. Or they might say sustainability is what we do as a company, ESG is how investors call it. Actually, investors don't think about it that way. You know, they think about it as it's about business resilience. So ESG will cover, yes, it will cover E, S, and G, but under the G, you also have anti-bribery and corruption, and you also have constructive challenge, and you also have the right board skills to be able to provide that constructive challenge, and you also have, you know, responsible marketing, and you also have, you know, product development, right? Or you have innovation. How are you actually taking advantage or seeing sustainability as an opportunity, building it into your product portfolio, building it into your service offering? You know, they're also interested in risk. They're interested in, you know, HR and culture. So I think ESG is by far the widest lens. You know, the investor lens is by far the widest lens. And when it comes to actually talking that story, I think companies, again, focus perhaps too much on the rankers and raters and forget to tell the more holistic story around how all of these factors. And I understand why that is, because companies operate with different functions, and it's quite easy to say, well, you know, this is ESG issues, also known as sustainability issues. Mostly that content and that thinking and that doing will come from the sustainability team. But actually, that's, you know, we need to have a collaboration between the different functions within the organization, whether that is the risk function and the company secretariat function, the IR function, the, you know, all of those good functions. And
we've seen that, haven't we, with clients? We've seen a lot more collaboration,
absolutely,
particularly through the reporting lens, bringing people together. So that's, I mean, really exciting that we're heading in that right direction. I think there's great recognition, isn't there, in companies?
Just on a last point around the rankers and raters, we talked a little bit about it before, but I mean, obviously companies need to be conscious of their scoring, but by and large, a lot of investors use the raw data. So they might not necessarily use the scoring. They might take the raw data and pull it into their own proprietary databases or proprietary systems and software systems. They might look at the laggards and might look at the leaders, but the disclosure, the quality of the disclosure is much more important than the actual score. And equally, you know, we hear a lot about how the rankings are, or the ratings are very different between one provider and the other provider. But actually, companies don't, investors don't really see that as a problem, right? They see that as sell-side research, really. You know, if someone is getting one ranking, one rating, and another one in one methodology and a different in another methodology, then that's not a problem. It just means that someone might have picked up on some particular factors or other factors that another one haven't picked up on. And again, if it's not really about the scoring and it's more about the data, then who cares about the actual the variation there? Now, going back a little bit to sort of taking a step back to the bigger story here, we tend to see companies fall into sort of three different categories. We have sort of the siloed approach, where companies tend to talk about sustainability as a very much a siloed thing that we do. They might not even call it sustainability, might call it corporate social responsibility, which seems to be a sort of a old world term that it still has and smells a little bit like philanthropy and bake sales, something that investors really couldn't care less about. They you know, they make loose commitments, certainly have no objectives or targets specifically around their effort. In terms of how they deal with the disclosure landscape, it is very regulatory driven. Then second category, which is sort of journey towards integration, where companies are, you know, thinking more about working together within the company, thinking more about, you know, this is perhaps slightly more strategic. They will have more targets and objectives specific that you can sort of hold them to account for. They might be trying to deal with the sort of framework spaghetti, but, you know, will get stuck perhaps in trying to map it all out and get overwhelmed by it. They're still trying to figure out what are the right channels for actually communicating that. And the third category, which is around the strategic integration, which is really those who are getting much closer to getting it, right? They might have a set of communication that is, you know, you might have a report that is really sort of telling your overarching story. They might split out their communication in disclosure and in communication. So ESG disclosure, ESG communication, two different things, right? You're trying to communicate something very specific when it comes to disclosures, something that is perhaps an external request, whereas your communication is you owning the story. So they're understanding that, and they are communicating those two different stories, or not two different stories, but two sides of the same story, using different formats that they have discovered work well with those audiences, because again, they know much more about the audiences that they are trying to reach.
And I was just going to say, and of those three groups, Anne, how would you place sort of the FTSE 100 in terms of percentages? Is it sort of a third, or is it we've got more a journey in the middle, sort of trying to make this transition?
We still have quite a few sitting in the middle, and then we have I don't want to put a number on it, but maybe we have a sort of 15% who sit in the last category. Something along those lines, you know, trying out different formats, trying out actually what works, what doesn't work. But I think it's also, it very much depends on the amount of resource. You know, that's one of the things we hear from clients all the time, right? Resource. How do we deal with this? And I've mentioned it a couple of times, but, you know, getting that effort in initially, getting the right approach, and then just continuously updating.
Would you think it's fair to say that there are less people in the siloed bucket, or the ones in the siloed bucket realize they can't be in the siloed bucket for much longer in terms of the conversation? As that conversation sort of permeated, do you think most corporates today that we need to move on this journey towards integration.
Yeah, I think most companies are realizing this, but it's that you know, we all, you know, leading busy lives and working together cross function takes longer, right? And you can't manage it in the same way, and you can't control the process in the same way. So I think, you know, companies are struggling, and I think the IROs have a prime position there because they have that initial contact with investors, for instance, where they can, you know, better perhaps pull the right people and perhaps be that, and they are sort of the facing, you know, facing the investors, and therefore have ultimately the accountability to them. So perhaps more emphasis on, or perhaps more motivation to actually get that story right, and getting a hold of the right people within the organization, and getting those people together to lead that integration further.
Super.
So I wanted to just highlight a little bit on what we were talking about, different formats. So sort of stage one here is, in fact, it should have a stage 0, which is companies have an annual report and a website where they talk a little bit about their ESG commitments. And then we have a stage 1 where they perhaps have gone out and they now have a sustainability report. But perhaps that is, you know, trying to tell too many things in one go, right? They have some commitments they need to communicate, they need some progress on that, they need to communicate everything from the sort of raters and rankers and their, you know, NGOs and all the other employees who want to have their stuff in there as well, because they're trying to communicate to all of them at the same time. Then perhaps the stage 2, they then get a little bit more sophisticated and go, well, actually, we need to split that story because it doesn't work. We can't have all of this data in there, and it just, from a balance perspective, it doesn't work. So then we end up having a data and policy supplement, right, for rankers and raters and ESG audience, investor audience really, and a sustainability report, which is perhaps still for you know, a very wide audience. Then stage 3 is perhaps more focused around thinking, okay, so actually that worked well. What else could we do to actually make that story much more targeted at the right audience and the right formats? And then we see how that suite becomes, you know, expands. You know, with the TCFD, we worked with a number of companies on TCFD over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's very obvious that that story is going from a, you know, start out first year with a table in the annual report, then all of a sudden becomes 2 pages, and then it becomes 6 pages, and then that becomes unbalanced for the annual report. So we then have a climate report on the side that tells that story around, you know, participation in the sort of in the wider climate debate and transitioning to a sort of low climate economy. And you know, equally, as companies start talking much more around purpose, impact, etc., that is perhaps then the wider society story. Whereas as companies then start thinking about, actually, this is a competitive advantage for us, for when we work with governments, when we work with councils, when we work with big companies for whom ESG is incredibly important, and we need to do our bit to make sure that they look good, then we also start to look at perhaps ESG marketing brochures. So that's sort of the direction of travel as we see it at the moment, which aligns, by the way, quite nicely with what the FRC is saying in their report on the future of corporate reporting. I've got a couple of examples here. One of them is Tesco, and I don't think I need to go into why Tesco's over the years have needed to communicate so well on this. They've obviously had a number of shareholder resolutions at their AGM over the years. So they very early on had a lot of pressure, and therefore have had to, you know, think strategically about how they communicate this. So they have obviously an annual report. They've got a sustainability update that reports on their commitments. They have 15 topic sheets, so specific topic sheets, where parts of it will probably stay the same and parts of it will be updated every year, because that's all the performance data, etc. And that allows NGOs, people with particular, you know, special interest organizations, etc., to go in and hone in on those particular issues. They integrate ESG into their everything from their performance presentations to, you know, capital markets day presentations, etc. They have a part of their website where they make it very easy to get, you know, to find all of these things. It doesn't sit on over 24 4 different places on the website. It sits in a particular section where you can get all the many policies, which is good for rankers and raters. You need to have all of those formal documents as policies and make them publicly available. You can get to all of the different reports, all of the different fact sheets, and all of the presentations in one place. And a similar... Go ahead.
A lot about that was recognizing the different needs of the different stakeholders and the way that they want to receive and process the information, right? So moving, as you said, from that spectrum of kind of disclosure, hardcore disclosure, right through to communicating more proactively and engaging with stakeholders. Yeah.
And a similar thing with Rio Tinto here, I wanted to mention just they have a data book, which is essentially an Excel with all the different disclosures in there as well. So that's where they then deal with the disclosure story. And that is also sort of a nice plug and play perspective in terms of investors, that they can plug that right into their own systems. And I want to finally just finish on this slide here, sort of 3 top tips. Separate that disclosure exercise from the communication exercise. So you can own the communication of what it is that you're trying to achieve, your commitments, your role in transitioning to a low carbon economy, etc., and your role in society. And then you have your disclosure story in other formats. The disclosure story for, the data, the policies, etc., for rankers and raters, etc. And know your audience, know them really well, and know what their preferred formats are. Understand who your key investors are, and what their preferred formats and their preferred data points, etc. And it might be that they could easily go and find this information that they want on your website, but actually they just send you a questionnaire. But if that is a really big investor, you may want to fill it in nonetheless. So prioritization, absolutely. And then finally, don't forget the commercial opportunity, whether that is having, talking about how you are benefiting, how you are contributing in a commercial and positive way from a sustainable development.
Super. Okay. I mean, that's great. Really given us a lot of food for thought there. Now I want to hand over to Dan, who's actually going to take us through how do we bring that story to life, and how do we meet some of those disclosure and communications challenges, particularly in the online environment. And one thing I wanted to note is that with the IR Society Best Practice Awards this year, and if you haven't taken a look, please do look at them. They recognize best practice IR in the industry, but really to reinforce this idea that companies need to take a holistic view of their IR engagement to meet the needs of not just their shareholders, but wider stakeholders. We've combined 2 awards from last year. So we've combined the best overall comms of the investment proposition with our digital communications award, reflecting the integral nature of digital to how companies need to communicate moving forward. And we have 1 new award that's called the Best IR Communications and Engagement Program, which again is looking for evidence that we're communicating through all different facets, face-to-face, digital, print, all those sort of different channels. So Dan, take it away.
Thanks, guys. Chat if you can't see the browser right now, but hopefully I can take you through some live examples of sites. And as the guys were saying earlier, there's a little bit of a misnomer here, and I wanted to just bring it to life in a visual way, because obviously with what we're talking there around corporate purpose, around aligning with that compass impact of what we're trying to do, companies and the expectations of companies in terms of how they're communicating has a varied approach in terms of it. And we've seen 64% of ESG pages actually located in the IR section, very much similar to what you're seeing here on screen with the guys at BHP. They've created an ESG and sustainability section within their investor section. And to do that, obviously, that's absolutely fine and kind of aligns with very much that journey that Anne was talking about how companies bring content to life, the evolution of stakeholders and their requirements, and really thinking about kind of what their priorities are and what the content is. Because this is very much a early stages of that process, that kind of trajectory, the siloed approach that we were talking about in terms of communications. And the way of describing it is you've essentially got a nice little introduction piece in terms of what's happening at the top of the page, and then further information is aligned with environment, in terms of them being able to click through, seeing, okay, there's climate change information, there's closure planning, there's things around environmental management. And businesses like this are essentially saying, okay, well, here's all of our content. It's probably in other areas of our site. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a little bit of an ESG hub that basically takes people through and links up to different sections. So for example, you know, if you're then going to be clicking on some of these information areas, you would then be taken through to the sustainability section where there would be maybe a case study or more information. But this is very much at the low end of the spectrum. And obviously the evolution we've been talking about, this isn't that holistic approach, but it does achieve something in terms of giving a destination to users to find more information. And I think that a lot of it is around kind of understanding how that then links through to sustainability content. We look at someone like Glencore, again, a very similar approach in terms of that. They've aligned with 11 focus areas. They're talking about things like climate change and water use. And interestingly, again, located in the investor section, but this then takes me through when I click on climate change to an ESG A to Z, which is great. It's two ways of accessing the information, but the ESG A to Z is now in sustainability. So that crossover of understanding the personas, understanding the users, understanding where they need to go for information is a little bit like the muddied water or that spaghetti approach that Anne was referencing earlier. And I think that disclosure universe of information is very much kind of understanding how we get the best out of this for our audiences so they can find information that's relevant to them quickly, succinctly, and obviously then in an engaging format. Because when we look at it, obviously very text heavy kind of content from both of these examples. Someone like Novo Nordisk is going a little bit different on this, and they've actually started putting their ESG portal within the sustainable business section of their site. So again, they're using data sheets to bring this to life. So not just simply linking through to other content, they're also starting to put content on that page. So now when they're talking about their focus areas, again, similar alignment of energy, water, CO2, etc. They're actually looking at them providing the user with that information. So there's no duplication. There's actually no ESG section within the IR piece. And again, understanding then how you can bring that content to life. They're using Tableau charts, nice little interactive features, giving you the ability to then find out more information about each one of these kind of key areas. And again, aligning with the user of being able to then discover more information as I click through and discovering kind of what's happening year on year in terms of their progress and their kind of ability to develop the narrative around it. If we then look at someone like a Barclays, and again, we're now going to go back into this journey of integration, thinking about the stakeholders, thinking about how we win confidence from our ESG narrative. These guys are again aligning the resource hub and thinking about how they can showcase the approach, thinking about the progress highlights. And then fundamentally what they've got is key ESG themes, they've got reporting and disclosures, they've got statements and policies. And what's really interesting from our side is that, you know, allowing that additional content. Now, this is more ESG specific content. This isn't duplication of things within sustainability or case studies around water use. This is specifically talking about all the elements that Anne was talking about earlier around, you know, if I click on raters and rankers, I'm now going to be taken through to a page that again aligns with more information about these in terms of the Sustainalytics scores and everything in between. So this is now a transition away from that kind of more simplified approach. And what they're also doing is backing it up with additional information. And again, we're seeing a lot of that in terms of the narrative behind businesses being able to then provide specific information. And you'll also see, relating to what we're talking about there, the purpose being front and center, that North Star, that compass that Sally referenced earlier. You've got companies like HSBC. Again, now we're going back into an investor section, ESG investors reporting on the performance. And again, more ESG specific reference content. But again, still text heavy, still thinking about, you know, how that relates to your kind of suite of documents, whether it be a data pack, whether it be the annual report. And again, aligning with that reporting center and being able to kind of drill through into these pages and see, again, more latest reports, more information. So it's fairly kind of, you know, detailed at this point. And obviously then it's about bringing it to life in an engaging way. And we look at it a lot with our clients in terms of how we can make sure that the content is really engaging from a usability point of view.
Dan, I was just going to ask, a lot of what you've shown us there is really making it easy for people, investors particularly, to find the information that they need. Mm-hmm. And it would be great, and I'm sure you're going to go on to it now, but just to show us how they're bringing that to life a little bit more, because there are, I know, speaking to investors myself, that they are looking for Of course they want that. That's a given hygiene factor, that they've got that information. It's very easy to get, but inspire us a little bit with some more exciting examples, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was setting the scene there because obviously it's all about that, winning confidence, winning the investor confidence. And I think with companies like BP, it's exactly that a notion, Sally, in terms of how they're bringing it to life. So here we're talking about the purpose being front and center, their ambition for net zero. We're aligning it with other publications like the Investor Pack. But where they go further than the examples I've shown you is not only from just having specific content and aligning with that trajectory in terms of the integration of the narrative, but they also start to talk about the reporting from use of rich media. They're actually, interviewing. An example here is Ann Simpson from the California Public Employee Retirement System. So they're actually talking to investors in terms of what BP's doing, transparency around how they're communicating their narrative. And again, bringing that to life in an engaging way beyond just the metrics and the reports and the data sheets that's required. And also then aligning it to things like news stories and different case studies. Because again, those ESG kind of stories are really kind of being helped to be brought to life for the audience in a key and engaging way. And I think then that relates directly to your point, Sally, in terms of how they can then articulate that, but not only through these kind of pages, but also then going beyond it. So you've got things like this where you've got the report, and this is a 45-page document, goes into a huge amount of detail about what they're trying to achieve. But they're also then promoting it through other channels. So starting to think about social. So for example, here, and also partnering with other events, similar to what we're doing right now. But again, getting the voice out there, getting their narrative out there, engaging with audiences through different mediums, and thinking about how you can articulate that story beyond simply the standardized kind of, as you say, make it easy to find information in the sustainability section approach to ESG communications. Now, just while I'm going, I also wanted to just touch on this notion of confusion in terms of where things sit, because I think it's something that we're wrestling with quite a lot. And again, aligning with what Anne has talked about earlier in terms of where this narrative is sitting. The example I wanted to show you was Pearson, and Pearson used their narrative in terms of their purpose and ESG performance. They're breaking the mold from having it within the IR section. Some companies obviously aligning it to sustainability, as Anne was relating to earlier, and that interchangeable nature when it comes to how we're communicating with our audiences. And they do this quite nicely with kind of aligning with the purpose, thinking about ESG performance. Again, fairly kind of dry content could be brought to life a little bit more engagingly. But they've also then got things like their ESG reports, and again allowing you to drill down more kind of succinctly. Unilever go further, and actually they've got a whole sustainability section within their investor kind of portfolio. And again, they can do this because they're actually breaking that bond between sustainability and their own planet and society structure. So again, they can have that more focused element of investors and sustainability in terms of what's happening out there within the market, and then linking through to the separate site within their kind of their company and strategy sections within sustainability. The final few examples I just wanted to touch on are really kind of that muddying of waters. And again, it seems to be something that's coming predominantly through the maybe US markets around sustainability being interchangeable with ESG. And again, aligns with that notion of how far it's pushed in terms of, ESG being, kind of a snapshot of sustainability, or vice versa in terms of the broader communication aspect. And again, just referencing Anne's kind of notes earlier around the AT&T example here, great that you've got social responsibility, but breaking it down within ESG, actually there's so much more there that could be kind of articulated in terms of, product development and different things. So again, thinking about that narrative and how that can be brought to life. General Motors have a sustainability microsite. They're using ESG management, ESG governance to communicate with their audiences. And interestingly, as I scroll them through here, when I click on things like ESG management, it's very much interchangeable in terms of the narrative being very specifically around sustainability when you're looking at things like ESG strategy. So again, it's breaking that norm away from differentiating the two. Touching on also then the matrix and the rankings and the raters that we were talking about there, more specifically, obviously the kind of the SASBs of this world. General Motors, really nice integration of all of these things like SDGs. And when you're starting to look at things like Verizon as well, they're also then going, a little bit further in terms of how they can pull things in, like the SASB index, their data index, and obviously then bringing these things to life in a really engaging way, not just through messaging from senior management, but also then, pull out stats, nice use of videos. And again, this relates very much to that engaging kind of narrative that we've spoken about a few times in terms of, bringing all of this to life in an engaging way.
And Dan, just to pick up on that, in your experience of working with corporates, are you seeing them think more carefully about how to communicate, I guess, what I would call their sustainable business strategy, rather than, we've talked a lot about sustainability, ESG, and there's confusion over that. But my personal view is companies shouldn't have a sustainability strategy and a corporate strategy. They should have a sustainable business strategy, and this should be integral. Are we beginning to see how companies are weaving that broader story, whatever you label it, because I think labels can be a bit confusing, into how they're talking about things, that it's no longer just about driving financial returns, but they are concerned with wider issues and they understand the impact?
Absolutely. And it's that wider narrative that we're helping our clients with at the moment. And it's understanding that, the silos of audience requirements aren't as clear cut as maybe they once were. And also then thinking about the personas of the audience in terms of where they're going for the content that's important. And I think that joined up unilateral approach is something that businesses are struggling with in terms of how they're communicating the right kind of message to the right kind of audience. And as you say, I don't think it's, when we're talking about an ESG communication strategy, it's not just acceptable maybe to go with, here's an ESG page with investors and it links off to some sustainability content. It's actually thinking about how that flows right the way through the site, understanding how it impacts all of the different audiences and the stakeholders, but also thinking about the business in terms of where you are now versus where you want to be in 2 or 3 years' time. So there's nothing wrong with going with a Glencore or a BHP approach, but actually, interestingly, when you look at something like a Glencore, they've evolved it over the last year or two, increasing the narrative, including that A to Z. So they're obviously on a journey, and it aligns very much with everything that Anne was talking about earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So we're pushing from the bottom up, but it sounds like there's almost an umbrella story that companies are struggling a little bit to house everything together. So yeah. I think that's the challenge moving forward. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. That was super interesting. I just thought, as a final kind of question, and then maybe Dan, we're talking to the IROs today, who are obviously frontline with the investors, and also, that point of engagement between the external market and the board. What are the kind of top tips that you would have for IROs to sort of meet the challenges of the marketplace moving forward, but more importantly, put them in a competitive position, a competitive differentiation in terms of this space? Because I think, everything that you've said here today says to me, corporates need to get ahead of the curve rather than getting caught up in this tsunami. So what would your top tips be? Mute.
One of us was going to do it, right? So it was me. I think I've said many of them before, really, but it's that investing the time and the resource up front, and set up an approach that makes it so much easier to maintain going forward. Prioritize data requests based on the sector you're in, based on your material issues, based on what your peers are doing, how advanced they are, based on the sort of investor makeup more generally, and prioritize content that has the biggest impact from if you're dealing with rankings and raters, that has the most impact from a ratings perspective, and ensure that you have something like policies and certifications and stuff like that available on the website, make publicly available, right? Yeah, there might not be many who is looking for it, but it won't count unless it's publicly available. But fundamentally, the right format for the right audience. I think that is really, really key. And then finally, making sure that you tell that story in a disclosure side and a communication side, and that communication aspect of it, is more holistic, and isn't just focused on the disclosures, but you own that story. And you've identified what that space is, that space that your competitors aren't owning, that you can own, and communicate that story.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is really around evolution. Don't be afraid to start somewhere and take us on a journey, because that's everything that we've been talking about today in terms of, you know, going from that siloed approach right through to, you know, the strategic integration of the comms.
Fantastic. So I think my key takeaways are you got to really own it proactively and really innovate moving forward. Fantastic suggestion. Thank you everybody for attending. We've got lots more to talk about. So if you want to hear and need any help in terms of bringing your story to life, it's a shame that Leighton couldn't be here to share some of his wider thoughts on telling that sustainability story. But everybody have a great day and great rest of the conference. Thanks very much to the IR Society and the team at Coleman Street. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.